I'm going to start recording because I think I was going to post this on. Welcome. So when I teach this, I always start by telling my students, and this scares a lot of them, I say, I know you weren't expecting this, but we're going to begin with a quiz. All right. So sorry, everyone, you can't leave now. You signed up. So question number 1 in the quiz, is that a bird?
Yes.
All right. You're doing great. All right. How about that one?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you guys are doing great. So we could keep on going. And so my students very, soon realize, oh, wait a minute, this is not a quiz to be frightened of. Look at this. This is so easy. These are all birds. And then I ask them, okay, well, you got all the questions right. These are birds. How do you know? All right. What features did you use? Anyone want to shout out how you knew these were birds?
Feathers and wings.
They got feathers. They got wings. Anyone else?
They fly.
They fly. Good. Okay, I'm going to stop the flood of answers right there, just because we have so much cool stuff to talk about. Those were good answers. Now, to be honest, because I teach anatomy, I would just being me, I'd want to add a few more. But also, this is a little foreshadowing. I'm adding more because actually the question which seemed really easy to you is actually enormously difficult. And so it will help highlight how difficult it is if I, add to this. So when I say feathers, yes, birds have feathers. Not only do they have feathers, they got different kinds of feathers. There's downy feathers. There's, different the ducklings here are just covered by downy feathers. But then there are special kinds that you see on the wings or on the tail. They can have different structures. A big one that I'm going to talk about here, let me just hold this up because, yeah, it's what's called an asymmetrical feather. So if you look where the ridge is in the middle of the feather here, notice that most of the feather is on one side of it, that one side is narrower than the other. That's actually something that helps them fly, that they're asymmetrical. That term will come up in a second. But anyway, so not only do they have feathers, they got all kinds of feathers. The flight feathers are nice and broad. They had wings, someone said. So wings are special. It requires special anatomy of the bones that make up the shoulder joint. That would be a scapula, a coracoid, and these fused collarbones, which we call a furcula. So if you pull on the wishbone at Thanksgiving, that's the clavicles. But whereas we humans have 2 clavicles which are separate, they have 2 which are stuck together. If we look further on the arm, we're going to see, yes, they do have the same bones that we do. So maybe that looks familiar from your eating chicken wings. They do have a humerus, a radius, and ulna, carpal bones, just like we do, but a lot of them are fused together. They have a tiny little thing sticking out on their wing there called an allula. They've got these neat muscles here, and the neat trick, and I'm sorry, this is a beautiful trick, is how do they pull up on their wings? They actually pull up on their wings from a muscle which is below their wings. How do they do that? Because the tendon actually goes up and around and through a hole right here. So that's a neat trick. So suffice it to say that their wings are neat. But then we look at their legs, and their legs are unique. First, they're bipedal. No way could you fly or evolve the ability to fly if you had to walk on your arms. The fact that they were walking on their legs and their hands were free, that was important. They've got a lengthened foot. They've got a unique ankle joint, many fused bones. Their hip has an open hip socket. That's weird. They've got these really long pubic and ischium bones. That's the pubic bone there. That's the ischium. This is the hip of an emu. So that's really weird. Most of them have 3 toes pointing forward, 1 toe pointing back. I know this is going really fast. This is just the introduction, so we have stuff to talk about later. This tarsometatarsus has a weird name because different bones have smushed together to make one solid bone. The same thing happened in their hand. Their skull is neat. They've got holes in their skull in unique places. Lots of bones have stuck together. They've got a ring around their eyes. They have a toothless beak. We could go on. Their skull is neat. Their brain is really big. Birds are very smart for their body size. Their vertebrae are neat. They have long necks. They have fused bones in the hip area. They have holes in cervical vertebrae that I'll get back to in a second. Those holes actually help them breathe. The hip is fused to the vertebral column. The tip of their tail is fused. If you look here at their ribs, they're anchored together. They've got a big keeled sternum. That's what, where chicken breast meat is here on their sternum or their breastbone. So you came up with a great list. And I just added it to it, and so I have added some features. We'll add some more. Suffice it to say that all of us should be rather happy with ourselves. Using our list, we can identify birds. As long as we only use things that are alive today. If, however, you were to now include fossil animals in your list, well, it turns out our lists aren't very good. All right, there's only a couple of features that could maybe identify birds. It turns out it's really hard to identify a bird. And a lot of the experts are arguing about, is this one a bird? Is that one a bird? You'll see papers saying Archaeopteryx is the first bird, and then you'll say, maybe not. And then you'll say, maybe we should call Anchiornis the first bird. And then others say, no, let's call that a dinosaur. This thing that was first classified as a bird is now a dinosaur, and vice versa. It's actually hard to identify birds because there were things that look so very much like them. And so now what I'd like to just begin is this very long journey on how birds became birds, and then how the first birds became the modern birds. Now, if we were to start with fish, now we're obviously not going to stay here long. Here in purple are bones and features that the birds have. All right. And so if we look at a wing, it has like a humerus, a tibia, a humerus, a radius, an ulna, a femur, a tibia, fibula. It's actually the fish that started those. So if we want to look at a bird's body plan, all right, some of the elements of the body plan were put in place long before there were birds. Some were put in place in early amphibians, some in early reptiles, etc. And then as the reptiles diversified and we got closer to the dinosaurs, there was a group called the archosaurs. The archosaurs, that literally means in Latin, the ruling reptiles. Now, I'd just like to make this little aside because here we are with the group of reptiles which include pterosaurs. And I'm going to make a very big deal about where feathers come from. And we're going to focus on the meat-eating dinosaurs. All right, so with the meat-eating dinosaurs, a lot of them have feathers, as we'll see, and we're about to talk about that. But here are some very recent finds. This is a plant-eating dinosaur that has fuzzy stuff down its back. All right. So this plant-eating dinosaur, not a close relative of birds. And some of these things are pretty long, 6 centimeters, but they're stiff and they're hollow. So they're not really the kind of things we're going to see in theropods, but they're a something. Oh, and then there's this one, same thing. It's covered in something. It's a plant-eating dinosaur. All right, what are those things? And actually, it actually has 3 different kinds of structures. What covers most of its body is a little different from its arms and thighs. And that's a little different from the long filaments on its legs. So that had a something. This thing is a relative of the horned dinosaurs. And on its tail, it's got this ridge of something. All right, these bristle-like structures, about 16 centimeters in length, and they're tubular. And then even, and this has been known for a while, the flying reptiles called the pterosaurs, which were not dinosaurs, they were covered in these hair-like bristles, and we're just not quite sure what they were made of. So the reason I'm raising that is if it was once thought that birds invented the feather. So in the family tree, feathers would have started here. All right. However, we have, and I've been teaching prehistoric life for about 20 some years. It's while I've been teaching that it was first documented that dinosaurs like Sinosauropteryx, that was the first one that was official, had feathers. So then it appeared that feathers belong to this group of dinosaurs and the birds. But if what I've just said, those bristle-like structures have a common origin with these proto-feathers that we see elsewhere, well, then maybe feathers, or at least the first rudiments of feathers, started before the meat-eating dinosaurs in the common ancestors of these plant-eating dinosaurs and the meat-eating dinosaurs. But if the flying the pterosaurs, if they had something homologous to feathers, maybe if we wanted to ask where feathers come from, we'd have to go all the way back here on the family tree. So this is exciting. This is all fairly new stuff. You know, we've been digging up fossils for centuries and centuries, but it's really been in the last 20 years, and then in the last 10 years and 5 years, you know, all these new discoveries are kind of shaking up what you know, we think we know, et cetera, and who knows what will be discovered next. So this is an exciting field. But I'd like to get to birds before we then go into what you know, comes after that. So if you take the meat-eating dinosaurs, well, they have lots of features that I would link to birds. Now, I'd like to talk about it like this way, but here's another way that I could, you know, kind of frame the question. I could frame the question, say, let's say you're digging and you find some fossil bones and you say, ooh, is it a dinosaur? Is it a meat-eating dinosaur? What's called a theropod? That's your question. You want an answer, yes or no? Well, if you're going to answer a question like that, there are just rules. You just can't say, yeah, call it a dinosaur. Yeah, put it in this group. Sure, I'm good with that. There are rules. You belong in this group if you have the traits. So if you were to list traits that meat-eating dinosaurs have, they would be things like this. But then we realized that the first birds had those traits as well. All right. So these meat-eating dinosaurs, they're not birds. All right. Most of them, like T-Rex and Allosaurus, they're not even, I mean, nowhere close to birds. But it turns out that a lot of their features, just the way that the shoulder joint faces, the fact that they have 3 toes pointing forward, the fact that they're bipedal, walking on their legs so that their hands can get bigger, that these are things which will lay the foundation for the birds which come later. Now, the theropods are such a big group that we can then split it into subgroups. So as the family tree trucks along, there are more traits which get here, including in vertebrae, there are holes. I'm sorry, does someone have a question? Okay. I might mute anyone who's not muted, but feel free to, you know, feel free to ask any questions or throw something in the chat if you want. So here there are vertebrae which have holes, and the theropod dinosaurs got those. Now, I'm not sure how excited you are about vertebrae with holes, but this is so important for the birds. Not only does it make them lighter and helps them fly. I mean, you know, lots of, you know, a couple of different things had hollow bones to make them lighter. The sauropod dinosaurs did, the pterosaurs, which were flying reptiles, did, and the birds do. All right. But here's a funny thing about birds that a lot of people don't know. All right. Birds have the best system of breathing anywhere. They are so much more efficient than everybody else. But how they do it, and this is going to be a little complicated, so I'm just going to run through it quickly. You're going to have to follow 2 breaths, because when birds inhale the first time, okay, air comes down the trachea through the syrinx. We'll mention that with the songbirds because that's where they sing from. All right, and then it goes into some air sacs. And then when they exhale the first time, it goes to their lungs. And then when they inhale the second time, it goes to these other air sacs. And then when they exhale the second time, it goes out their body. So you need to actually trace 2 breaths to get air through a bird's body. So it's a little more complicated, but it makes them much more efficient. They get oxygen out of all of their air. But the point is, these holes are now where some of those air sacs go. It's called numinization. So you might not make a big deal out of it, like, oh, here's some meat-eating dinosaurs. We're seeing some holes and some bones. Oh, in the next group, we see a few more holes. We see a few more holes. But then, at some point you realize, oh, wait a minute. When birds start to fly and have much higher oxygen demands, they already had this new way of breathing that they inherited from their ancestors. All right, so a lot of these terms, they might not like seem overly, like exciting or important. But when we get to the first, birds, the reason I'm mentioning it, it's because there's something that birds use with it. All right, and so the theropod dinosaurs have traits. But if we use those traits to identify what a theropod dinosaur is, the first birds have those traits. So birds are theropod dinosaurs if you follow the rules. If you follow the rules, anything like with traits like these gets called a theropod dinosaur. Anything that has these traits is called a neotheropod dinosaur. All right. And birds, at least the first birds, have those traits as well, including that wishbone that I talked about. The fancy name for that is a furcula, where the two clavicles fuse. It turns out birds aren't, today, they're the only thing that have that. But in the fossil record, lots of these dinosaurs did as well. All right. And so this is a dinosaur, but since it's a neotheropod, it has a number of the traits which we identify with birds today. That list of traits that say, aha, you're a bird. Now, I just ask you to watch the colors. All right. So notice here I'm using red. I'm going to start using different colors. But at the end of this presentation, you are going to see a bunch of bird features. Remember at the beginning, I said, look at all of the features that define a bird. Well, we're going to see them pop up slowly, a little bit at a time. And I'm going to use the color red for the ones which are appearing by the theropods or the neotheropods. I'm sorry, I thought I could catch it just at the end. All right, so we'll just pause here. So anyway, here in red, these are like the wishbone, the long hands, certain openings in the skull, the hip. Where did my hip go? So if you look at this bird hip, look, it has an open hip socket. Look how long the pubic bone is. Animals don't have pubic bones like that. Almost none of them do, other than the birds. Same thing with the long ischium here, the chambers for the air sacs. Those are bird things, but if you'll note, they occur at least by this point between the theropod and the neotheropod stages of the family tree. But the dinosaurs didn't stop, so we don't either. The next group, this is a new name. And once again, this is kind of exciting for me because I'm old. And I remember it wasn't this way. We didn't appreciate how, it was an idea that maybe birds descended from dinosaurs. Now, that's pretty much what everyone is very confident in. But all of the evidence has popped up in the past couple decades. So much so that if within the family tree of the theropods, we have a group that's named the Avetheropoda. Ave meaning birds, theropod meaning theropod dinosaurs. So clearly, we think that they are related because this group is now containing both of them. As we go along the way, I'd be happy to talk about ankles and all of these things, but I'm just going to hit the highlights. And if anyone really wants to talk about bird ankles, I'd be happy to. So Avetheropoda starts getting a lot more traits, including feathers. All right. So feathers were once thought to be, this is only something that we see with, this is only something that we see in birds. And that was, a few of you had that on your list, feathers are for birds. But apparently that's not entirely true. Dinosaurs could have feathers as well. Now, let me, be clear with what I mean by feathers. There are different kinds, all right? And so even today, right, if you were to look at, I'm sorry. Yeah. If you were to look at feathers and say, what do feathers do? Well, I think our first, thing is, they fly. These are flight feathers allowing birds to fly. Oh, but yeah, if you've got white feathers, that's going to absorb light. Black feathers reflect light. So, this could help you regulate your body temperature. Oh, it could help you blend into the surroundings so predators can't find you. If you want to know who to have sex with, and there's a whole bunch of species around, the females could say, oh, my males are the ones with the green heads, or the brown heads and the long tail feathers, or the white spot on their heads, etc. Okay. And so feathers can do a whole lot of things other than just fly, which is why it's exciting, because now that we start looking at dinosaurs, we start saying, look at that. They were fuzzy. All right. A lot of them had something on their skin. Now, what do you want to call them? I don't know or care. I mean, you can call them feathers. You could call them protofeathers. You could call them integumentary structures, whatever you feel comfortable with. We actually have some preserved in amber. There was a dinosaur tail preserved in amber. So we actually have these structures, and can say that feathers are not unique to birds. The first dinosaur to kind of show that in the 90s was Sinosauropteryx, one of the smaller dinosaurs. But you can see it has a lot of feathers around down its back, not for flight. All right, but once again, feathers do so many things like keep you warm or camouflage. So it doesn't seem as if flight was the original function of feathers. This is a tyrannosaur. It had feathers, all right, coming off of its skin. This is a big tyrannosaur, not as big as Tyrannosaurus Rex, but still pretty big. It's got feathers. So Tyrannosaurus Rex could very well have had feathers because some of its relatives did. And so as we start going up the family tree and get to the Tetanorans, that's a fancy word for fused tails, where the tip of the tail is more rigid. Now, you probably don't care about dinosaur tails, but we're going to see that actually becomes a bird trait, that birds will fuse the last vertebrae of their tail to make a solid bone called a pygostyle. So you could argue that a little of it has started here. All right, but once again, if you were to list what makes an Avetheropoda, well, even more air chambers in the bones. What makes a Coelurosaur? All right. All right, hand modifications, a longer arm. The sternum becomes one bone instead of lots of bones, a larger brain, etc. All of these are traits which we will see in the first birds here. All right, so feathers are appearing by this point. And once again, here I'm adding a color, if that's okay with you. I'm adding pink. So all of the things on this list, these are things that I would put on the list of what defines a bird. All right, early in the class, you said, feathers, wings, a beak, one of you in the chat, a nice answer of 3 toes pointing forward. And I just added a few more, but noticed that some of them I colored in red because they are in the dinosaurs in this zone. I'm sorry, starting on the theropods, ending with the neotheropods. Some I'm putting in pink because they're in dinosaurs in this zone. All right, let's go on. All right, because after this group, the Coelurosaurs, then all right, I'm sorry. I have so many things, I sometimes have earlier ones. As we start getting to the top of our family tree, we have a group called the Maniraptorans and the Paravians. So here's a Maniraptoran. Now you may notice, not only does it have feathers, it has what I would like to call are flight feathers. Now, technically, we use other terms like pennaceous feathers, and this would be a contour pennaceous feather, and we would have different names for the ones on the tails versus the wings, etc. Let's just call them, either contour feathers or flight feathers. But notice they're on the tail and on the arms. So not only do they have feathers, they have flight feathers. Could this animal fly? Absolutely not. So that raises the question, by the way, here I'm in purple now, that's the color. Why would you have flight feathers if you can't fly? The answer is, I don't know. Were you using it for display to your partner? Were you using it to help to scoop up things? If you were jumping in the air, could this help you glide a little or steer? I don't know. All right, but nevertheless, this thing that could not fly has flight feathers, and it is not alone. All right, so before we start getting to the really close ones. So Proto-Archaeopteryx has these feathers, they would be on the tail, Okay, this one has just kind of the fluffy, more downy feathers, but we'll get to a couple more. Caudipteryx, there are some feathers going here. Here you can see a big fan of feathers on the tail. This one, it's a little harder to see, but it has tail feathers as well. Okay, and ultimately then we're going to get to ones where actually we even know what color they were, because preserved in the fossil are pigment molecules. So for example, Anchiornis, this is a dinosaur. It would have had black feathers with some white bars, like a little reddish crown on its the tip of its head. All right. There are clearly different ones. Some are long scale. So this is a weird one. I'm going to apologize to you in a second. But notice it doesn't really have feathers as much as like really long scales and really long fingers. All right. This one was thought to be a bird until we realized it's a dinosaur. All right. And it's got such long wings that it could probably fly, as could this one, which I'll talk about in a second. This one has flight feathers on its arms and its legs. All right. And so as we start going through this family tree, not only do we get flight feathers, but then we get flight feathers in animals which are becoming smaller and smaller. And now we ask the question, could they fly? Could they glide? The answer for some of them is almost certainly no, but the answer for some of them is probably to some degree. So some of them were probably capable of gliding. Microraptor, with its flight feathers on 4 wings, could. I'm sorry, I said 4 wings. I meant to say its arms and a leg. Some people want to rename it the 4-winged dinosaur, or Tetrapteryx, because it has flight feathers on its arms and legs. You may not care about the flight feathers on its legs, but interestingly, the first birds actually had longer than normal feathers on their legs. Like, because we know birds don't end up that way, no one cares. And people weren't looking for like long feathers on the legs, because that doesn't make any sense. Modern birds don't have that. But it turns out the first birds did, and so did some of the dinosaurs. All right, so yeah, that's kind of interesting. So Microraptor could certainly fly. Now, I asked myself this philosophical question. One of my songs is actually a Microraptor song, and it ends with the philosophical question: what is the difference between gliding well and flying poorly? I don't know the answer to that. But if we're going to ask the question, could this thing fly? If it's pretty good at gliding and then just starts wiggling a little bit, is that the same thing as flying poorly? This is a philosophical question. I'll leave you to answer that for yourself. But the point is, here we are getting close to where we're going to see the group for the birds, the Aves group. And now we have flight feathers, and then even some which could arguably fly. Now, I do want to apologize for you, because in preparation for this talk, I wanted to add to the videos that I already have. So in the past week, I think I've added, I think like almost 10, not quite 10, but I added 2 last night, 3 today. There was one more on my list of to do that the time wasn't there and I didn't get to. So let me just kind of say what I was going to do. Here, we're focused on the feather ones, but actually there was a little bit of an aside. So like some of the relatives, they took like this hard right turn and did something weird like this one. It's not flying with feathers, but some of its relatives, they almost had a bat-like body structure. And then they had like membranes between their fingers, or it could be attaching to their side of the body. They had very long third fingers, which was weird. So it seemed that in this group that's starting to think about flight and gliding and experimenting, that there was this little family that experimented with a novel style of movement, having something, some adaptations which we see in bats, but they don't go anywhere. They become extinct. There aren't that many of them. So just there's a lot of dinosaurs saying, hey, you know what, maybe we should give this flight thing a try. All right. So I have more. I have a song with, Caudipteryx. I have a song with Microraptor. If you care, you can get a little. So if, at the end of this, at the prehistoric life party or the bird party, you want to like hear, Cody Turek songs and Microraptor songs, you can. But as I start to make the hard transition to the second part of the talk, this is the hand of a dinosaur. That's a dinosaur's hand. If we were to ask, what does the wing of the first bird look like? Well, it looks the same. Now, to help you out, I'm going to start coloring in the bones. All right, so I'm going to color the radius one color, the ulna another color, etc. And if we were to do that, we see they are not identical, but they're close. This wing is a little bit longer and lighter than this hand. But that's about it. Other than that, they have all of the same bones, including some unique ones, this orange one being kind of semicircular. That's unusual. Only this group of dinosaurs and the birds, the first birds, have that. The number of bones in the finger counts have that. And if you were to ask this question, and I asked this question, I've asked this question of experts. So not only is this my answer, it's the only answer I've ever been given. If you take Anchiornis, the one with the black feathers and the little reddish head, and you take Microraptor, and you take the first bird that we're going to talk about, which is Archaeopteryx, and you ask, why are they different? Why do we call one a bird, and why do we call the red ones the bird? And why do we call the other two dinosaurs? Why? All right, so Microraptor and Anchiornis are currently both classified as dinosaurs. Archaeopteryx is a bird. All right, well, they're all in the same group, Paraves. They all have long arms. Those of Archaeopteryx were a little bit longer relatively, They all have veined contour feathers on their arms, legs, and tail. All right, although Microraptor and Archaeopteryx, they have the asymmetrical ones. So let me give a shout out to asymmetrical feathers. The fact that this one is fat on one side of the vein and skinny on the other side of the vein, that's asymmetrical. That means that natural selection is favoring it for flight. You don't want to be fluffy when the wind hits you. You want strength there. So asymmetrical means that this bird is using its feathers to fly, so much so that natural selection is making it better for how wind hits it. The other birds so far, even if they have flight feathers, they're not asymmetrical. So natural selection apparently isn't making them better for flying. Anchiornis has symmetrical feathers. But here's a dinosaur that apparently natural selection was acting on its feathers to make it better for traveling through the air. Those of Archaeopteryx compared to Microraptor were a little broader. So notice these are nice wide feathers. The first birds had some of those. All of them had a small, big toe that was pointing backward to a degree. In Archaeopteryx, it was pointing back even more. So these are dinosaurs, and that's a bird. And if you were to ask why, well, there weren't any new features. This feature of long arms, Archaeopteryx just made them a little longer. The feathers, this dinosaur was making it asymmetrical, so was this one. The small toe, which was starting to face forward, being retroverted so that it could perch on branches, Archaeopteryx did it better than the dinosaurs did. Later birds would do it better still. So here's the frustrating thing. You can't point to something and say, that makes a bird. Birds have it, nothing that's not a bird have it. There's a couple of traits where birds have it a little bit more than non-birds, all right, but nevertheless, it's not quite as definitive. So we began with this easy test. It was easy to tell a bird. It's actually not that easy. There's no one feature that you can say, aha, it has this feature, it's a bird. And in fact, some of these bird features are just, extensions on features that things which weren't birds have. All right. I'd like to do a hard shift now, and because we have covered 80 million years to get to birds. But now that we're at birds, we're not done. So now I'd like to talk about the 150 million years of birds. So the first half of the talk was how do we get to birds? And now that we're at the first birds, how do we get to the birds which are alive today? Now, when we say that, here by the middle of the Jurassic period, in the middle of the Mesozoic, we have birds, I think a lot of us are picturing hawks and, crows and ducks and doves, etc. But that would not be the case, because the first birds look like that. They had teeth. They had claws on their grasping hands. They had this long reptilian tail. Now, sure, they had features that remind us of the birds. Look at that toe. It's retroverted, pointing forward more so than any dinosaur has. Dinosaurs can have long hands, but these are even longer. All right. We mentioned the feathers already. So certainly this is a bird in the way that no dinosaur is. But a lot of the traits I mentioned at the beginning, like that huge breastbone, I apologize, this sounds shallow of me. I'm not that impressed by a bird's ability to fly. So I'm sorry, like I'm not. And the reason is, like, look at my breastbone here. It's flat. Think of the last time you had turkey or a chicken. All right, their breastbones come out to here, and this is all flight muscles. If I had a breastbone that came out to here, and if my chest muscles were out to here, well, guess what? If I did this with my arms, things would happen too. All right, so that keeled sternum, that really helps birds fly today. But notice this didn't have it yet. So while it could fly, it wasn't good at it. It certainly couldn't take off, with one flap of its wings. It probably would have needed to get a running start or jump from a tree. So Archaeopteryx is a bird. All right, but make no mistake, this is not a modern bird by any means. Now, this is just a quick overview, but I pointed out in my playlist, I have more. And if any of you wanted to get heavier into the anatomy and oh, let's look at the skull. I mean, clearly I see there's teeth. That's a more of a dinosaur reptilian feature, not a modern bird feature. But there are other things on the skull that we could point out as well. I'm not going to get into them, but just, if this is something that interests you, feel free to no, where'd you go? There we go. All right. All right. So now we have birds. I'm sorry, this somehow got out of order. But these are not modern birds. So what happens? Well, we will now build modern birds over 150 million years. And that list of traits, which we already had, you saw there were different colors, some added at this stage of the dinosaurs. Now we're going to add more at different stages of the birds. The first thing that the birds do is shorten the tail. Archaeopteryx had a long tail, so did a couple of other ones. So the most primitive birds have this long reptilian tail. And if you ask, what do the first, so there's a couple birds that have this. One of the first things that birds do is they shorten the tail. And in fact, not only do they lose vertebrae from the tail, but then they fuse some of the bones together, making what's called a pygostyle. All right, and so if you were to look at a modern bird today, somewhere, and you were to look at its tip of its tail, you would see fused bones. All right, so there's a fused bone, not individual vertebrae, called a pygostyle. All right, and the same thing here. This is a pygostyle, and so the next group of birds is called the pygostylia. The first birds did not have this. They had a long reptilian tail, but one of the first things that birds did was to fuse these bones together. All right. And so they keep on going. And if we were to start looking at, darn it, what just happened? Okay, I'm sorry. If I'm acting a little weird, it's because these are videos that I just added today. And I'm not quite sure where I put them. All right, so with this one, the green features are the ones that were added in the first birds. So notice that a lot of the features are things that the dinosaurs already had, but we're adding some features with the birds. And then in blue, all right, we're going to start adding some more after pygostylia. Sorry, it went to the next video. Right. So after the pygostyle develops, birds change a little bit, and we get to a new group, which is called the Ornithothoraces. So notice that in the pygostyle group, we get a pygostyle, reduced number of tail vertebrae, and we start to get a horny beak, even though teeth are still there. Notice this is the brown color. But now this group here, called Ornithothoraces, this is going to be where birds really get their act together. And for the first time, birds are good at flying. All right. Now they're going to do a lot of things like fuse some of the leg bones together. They get a tibio tarsus as the tibia fuses to some tarsal bones. All right. So if you were to ask, like in comparison to human bones, what bone is this? It doesn't make sense in human terms because that's a bunch of little bones fused together. So birds all over their skeleton do that. Instead of lots of little bones which aren't as good at flying, they fuse them together. The same thing with the hips and the vertebral column. So here are the vertebrae, there are the hips, but they all fuse together to form a synsacrum. All right. The name of this bird group is called Ornithothoraces, and the term thorax is in there because the birds, they get a keeled sternum. Look at how big that sternum is. Look for flight muscles. The first birds didn't have that. But also now the rib cage is changing and becoming much stronger. Not only do they have ribs going down, they have ribs going up from the sternum. So they have the regular ribs and then they have sternal ribs. Because if you were going to put all of the forces of flight on these bones, they need to be strong and reinforced. All right. And so there's that. There's this bone from the shoulder girdle, which comes and joins here and gets stout. Suffice it to say that the birds now start to have the wings and thorax of modern birds. All right. So the Archaeopteryx had more grasping fingers, but now as we get to this group, they start to form a carpometacarpus where individual bones start fusing together. And forgive me, but this is really impressive to me. Birds pull up on their wings from a muscle which is under their wings. How on earth could you do that? Well, the tendon from that muscle will go to this spot. It goes up and around, and there's an actual hole for it. All right, so if you look at an avian skeleton, they've got this really weird thing where the clavicles are fused to make a furcula, the procoracoid and the scapula come together, and where they do, there's a hole, and the tendon from a muscle that's under the wings goes up and around and through that, and so you can pull up on the wings from below. And that changes the center of gravity. And so this is one of the things that makes modern birds such good flyers. But the first birds did not have that. It was in the Cretaceous period that the ancestors of Ornithothoraces modified the shoulder, the wing, and the thorax. And modern birds now carry these traits. So once again, look at all of the blue features. These would be features that we put on modern birds. This is what makes a bird, but it didn't exist in the first birds. It involved in the Ornithothoraces. This group was so successful, they take over the world. However, the group that was most successful is no longer with us. They die when the dinosaurs die. So there's a group of birds called the opposite birds, or enantiornithes. They don't make it past the mass extinction. The group that does, it's a minor group as far as we can tell. It's not the most common, all right? So there are two groups. The opposite birds, they're the success story. They're on every continent. They're, size of sparrows, the size of vultures. They're everywhere, but then they die. And so it was the other group which would then lead to modern birds. Somewhere along the way, they reduced the size of their fingers. Their beak starts to get toothless, although that does happen in stages. Like, the bottom could be toothless before the top, or, this very tip still has teeth, but the rest doesn't. So losing their teeth came in steps. So here in this part of the family tree, this is where the orange traits come. Now, there was that mass extinction, as I mentioned. What did that do to birds? And the answer, this is one of the big things that we don't know. There's two options. Option number one is only one lineage of bird survived the mass extinction that ended the Cretaceous period. And then after the extinction, it diversifies to all of the birds alive today. So that's one option. It seems that a second option is the correct one, that just before the mass extinction, the bird lineage alive today had produced a couple of branches, 2, 3, maybe 4. The thing that's difficult is these fossils are fragmentary. So bird bones are small and light. And if you don't have all of them, and if you just have some fragments of a bone. So we know that lots of birds did go extinct when the dinosaurs died. All right, so when that rock falls from the sky, all right, hits the Yucatan Peninsula, 60% of life dies out. And that would include the most common birds of the day, those opposite birds, and many of the lineage alive today as well. But some survive. And we're just not sure where the branching starts. Did only one lineage survive the extinction and the branching starts after that? Or did the branching start just before the mass extinction? All right. So the most primitive birds alive today are called the old mouth birds or Paleognathus birds. All right. And these mostly live on southern continents, and most of them are flightless. So like the rhea, the ostrich, the emu, the cassowary, they are all in this more primitive group. And I have videos where we talk about why they're primitive. Interestingly, there is one group that can fly. It's a group of birds from South America called the tinamous. So these are the most primitive birds alive today. They are limited to southern continents. Most of them do not fly. And if you wanted to watch my video, I could talk about which skull bones are different in the old mouth birds like the rhea and the tinamou, different from all of the birds that you know. So we could talk about it, but I'm not sure that you care all that much. And then I have videos which just kind of show where they live, you know, on what, so I have maps of the world. And so the kiwi is down here, and we talk about those a little bit. Okay. Then of the new mouth birds, this was not a thing before people started comparing molecules. In the old days, people just classified birds based on anatomy, and they'd say, oh, let's make primitive birds and advanced birds based on this. But once they started using genes, something that seems to be a thing is that the chicken group, and that would include turkeys and pheasants, and the duck and goose group, they form the next break from all of the other birds. So that means things that like hawks, herons, woodpeckers, songbirds, we're not getting to them yet. They're all more closely related to each other. That this Gallo-Anserae, which includes chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese, that's the next group. And there are some fossils which seem to suggest that this happened before the mass extinction. So once again, the bird lineages alive today, some evidence suggests that the branching starts prior to the mass extinction. Now, I would like to talk about modern birds, but before I do, just when the big rock falls out of the sky, nothing that was big survives. All right. So all of the things that make it to the next time period are woodchuck-sized or smaller. All right. That means Earth has no big predators anymore. There are 0 big predators on the planet. Mammals will eventually take advantage of this and give us wolves and bears and dogs, etc. But birds beat them to it. Mammals will take a while before they get their act together and get big predators. So when all of the dinosaur predators die here, it is the birds that take over first. So the southern screamer there, some of its relatives do. One of the interesting things about this bird is it still has claws on its wings, pretty big ones. And a couple of birds alive today do, but they're usually hidden under the wings. So while birds would lose their claws, a couple still have them today. Birds lose their teeth, but there are chickens which are mutated. They've been, mutated in the lab, which can start tooth development. All right, so birds still have genes to make teeth, even though they don't use them. Some birds still have claws. But from lineages like this, we get birds like this. which are 6 feet tall with the skulls the size of horses. So once again, birds become the first super predators after the dinosaurs die. So at this time, say horses are say the size of cats. So birds are eating horses back in the day. Birds are the huge predators, and mammals very often are quite small. I'm sorry, just one. Yeah, very good. The terror birds. Yes. That's the nickname for them. Because they're not related, it just so happened that all over the world, once the dinosaurs disappeared, over here, like this group of birds became flightless and got big, whereas somewhere else it was a different group. So over here it was a relative of the rails, and over here it was a relative, oh, who are the other ones? I think a stork. In any case, so yes, terror birds, that's a neat name, but it's, just kind of our nickname for them. They're not really related. So this thing is alive today, but some of its relatives got to be the forest rockets. Some of them could stand 9 feet tall, and they were predators up until very recently. So birds became the first big predators of the Cenozoic era. And South America still had some. So 4 million years ago, when North America touched South America, a couple of them came north, and you could actually get these 6-foot giant birds in Florida that had just come up from South America. All right. So this is kind of like an image of what Florida might have had to deal with, a couple of million years ago, where some of the 3-toed horses would have been preyed upon by these big predatory birds. Now, while some predatory birds did come north, a lot of things went south, like saber-toothed cats and giant bears. And so and then ultimately people hunting in groups. So eventually these birds would then become extinct. But there were other, huge birds. There were, in the American West, there were condor relatives that had wingspans of 18 feet. In South America, they could be 20-some feet, etc. So in this new Cenozoic era, with the dinosaurs gone, lots of birds then, diversified to take advantage of that. But I'd like to just kind of focus on the birds that we know and love. Where and when did they come from? So if I have 8 different orders of birds here in 8 different families, are any of them known from what's called the Precambrian? This is the first 4 billion years of Earth's history. Well, no. I mean, we don't even have animals until the end. So there are 0 fossils of birds in most of the Earth's history. Are there any fossils of birds in the 250 million years of the Paleozoic era? The answer would be no. So no birds, not a single one, from the Paleozoic era. The first birds are from the Mesozoic era. But if you were to ask, do you get doves? Did a dinosaur ever see a dove or an eagle or a rhea or a heron or a woodpecker or a turkey or a blue jay? The answer is no. None of these are known from the Mesozoic era. Maybe with one exception. Once again, getting back to the duck group. The duck group, that order, maybe, once again, we have fragmentary fossils. So maybe the answer is none, or maybe, yes, the duck order Anseriformes is known just before the end extinction. So once again, we don't want to base conclusions on fossil fragments, but nevertheless, that's a possible answer. So then the birds we have alive today, they're recent. Dinosaurs really didn't get to see them. All right, and so no dinosaur ever saw a hawk or a sparrow or a dove. And so these are all in the Cenozoic era. Now, if we split the Cenozoic era into epochs, Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, and then the more recent ones. And if we look at these 8 bird orders, once again, the duck one either right before the mass extinction or right after. A couple bird orders start in what's called the Paleocene, right after the mass extinction, and then the other ones in the Eocene shortly after that. So at the beginning of the Cenozoic, that's when the bird groups alive today really diversified. And this is actually going to make the genetics of it complicated, as I'll get to. Now, that's the orders of birds. If you ask, well, how about the modern family? So the family that has the doves or the ducks. So this is the order, but when do the ducks come? Well, that actually comes later. So the orders come first and the families come later. So here are 5 families that first appear in the Oligocene. There are 2 that first appear in the Miocene, and then 1 actually then later than that. All right, and so songbirds come late, but like, blue jays and crows, there were none of them in the first half of the age of mammals. They come back later. So the birds we see today, they haven't always existed by any means. Now, I have lots of videos on this, but just with the time of our talk, I'd like to just kind of wrap up this way. So if you look at a family tree of the birds alive today, the most primitive birds alive today are these old mouth birds. And once again, we think they broke off before the mass extinction. The chickens and the ducks we think are next. Then we think the water birds, and then we think some diverse land birds from like hawks to woodpeckers. The songbirds are actually last. They get much smaller, and they get a modification of the base of their trachea, which lets them produce song. It's called the syrinx. But this wasn't present throughout bird history, only at the very end. This is like the last big branch, but a very successful branch. All right, more than half of all birds alive today are in this this group. All right. So the question which we started with at the beginning is, how would you know if this is a bird? What features would you use? All right, and what I've then tried to do, go here, is by using all those different colors. What makes a bird was added in very gradual steps over not only the 80 million years in which dinosaurs became birds, but then in 150 million years when the first birds became the modern birds. So, as we look at these features, some were added in the early theropod dinosaurs, the later theropod dinosaurs, the first birds, et cetera. Each of these different colors refers to a different branch point here. Modern birds were well over 200 million years in the making. Now, if you were to take the number of species of bird alive today, it would be more than mammals, reptiles, and amphibians put together. So although we like to call the Mesozoic era the age of dinosaurs, birds are descended from dinosaurs, and their numbers outnumber mammals, reptiles, and birds. One could argue the age of dinosaurs hasn't really ended. And the dinosaurs are doing just fine, or at least some of them, one lineage, and they have added, a great biodiversity and a beauty to our world. So now with the modern birds, I'd like to conclude the talk. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shout them out, write them in the the chat. If you're my student, once again, you can just shoot me a quick line with, your quick synopsis of this. Anyone else, obviously shout out questions. I hope, you enjoyed the talk. We'll do some more. So if you're like in the Audubon Society, you'll get communications about more of these. If you look at the SUNY Orange Grapevine, same thing there. Best wishes to all of you. And if you have any questions about birds, please feel free to shout them out.